So we start. The last plenary session, what should RAID be doing to attract public and private investment? If we consider the challenges the planet will have to face regarding climate change, we'll need a model shift from other modes of transport to public transport and railways. As a result, investment will become essential for both maintaining existing lines and rolling stock, improving quality, and building new lines and rolling stock. In this purpose, UIC encourages, through its vision of RAID 2030, design a better future, the allocation of funds to invest in this model shift. This statement is aligned with the strategic vision for investment in RAID explained yesterday by Minister Wissing. It's aligned with the last discussion this afternoon and with the statement explained by Josef Doppelbauer. That is the reason why I have the pleasure to introduce Mr. Giorgio Travaini, who will be the moderator of this plenary called What Should RAID Be Doing to Attract Public and Private Investment? So Giorgio is the head of program in Eurosrail. He was for Shift to RAID, head of research and innovation, is responsible for coordination of the joint undertakings program with a view to ensuring that the activities contribute to the fulfillment of the objectives of the Shift to Rail Master Plan and then the Europe's Rail Master Plan. Prior to this position, he was a senior corporate advisor at Unife, advising on strategic topics and preparing Shift to Rail. So, Giorgio, I give the floor.
Thank you, Christophe. So I have the pleasure now to change a bit. As was said, I am moderating now this panel. So let's make it an alive panel because today you have in front of you an excellent round of panelists, and we will have also in 15 minutes or so, or 10 minutes or so, also an online presence. So I will briefly introduce you the entire set of panels, just to change a bit the settings, and then I will give the floor to the first panelist. So we will have with us, you don't see him yet, but he will arrive, Kristian Schmidt, Director for Land Transport for DG Move from the European Commission. Kristian Schmidt, he has been appointed as a Director for Land Transport since April 2021. He previously worked in different senior management positions. He worked in DEFCO. He worked as Deputy and Head of Cabinet of the European Commissioner Vice President Siim Kallas, Deputy Head of Cabinet of the Commissioner Paul Nielsen, and he had a series of diplomatic careers at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then plenty of other important activities. So you will have a top-notch speech. An equally top-notch speaker that is here with us in the table is François Davenne. I think he doesn't need a lot of presentation by now. But for all of you to know, it has been graduated in the École Nationale Supérieure des Télécommunications and also from the École Nationale d'Administration. And through his career, he continued to push, promoted interdisciplinary as a key factor for his success. In fact, he gained experience in international satellite communication, various roles in the housing sector, and also with strong financial and legal skill. Then you have with us as well Paul Hegge, Director of Public Affairs of Lineas. He doesn't want to say a lot about himself, but I can actually dig him up on LinkedIn, and I can see that he has a too long list in order to be said for his previous work. But for you to know, it has been around the sphere of the Belgian sphere at the highest level and also political level. Then we have Olivier Desfontaines, which comes from the Crédit Agricole and is covering the role of global head of rail sector. He has several years of experience in the transportation finance sector with Alstom Transport since 2001. And he launched himself a rail franchise in 2006 as a new successful business of Crédit Agricole. So he has been based in Paris, London, and also he was involved in numerous type of rail transaction, merger and acquisition, and so on and so forth. And he graduated from the London Business School. So I think you have with you a panelist which it's very, very much interesting. And since in the last panel we kick-started with a presentation, this time we will not. So this time we have with us François Davenne, who will start from delivering his speech. And François, I give you the floor. You have 15 minutes.
So thank you, Giorgio. I will try to be shorter than that because I think that will be interesting to take questions. That's quite a tricky question for railway to say what have we to do to attract public or private investment. So what I would try to say from UIC, so UIC is International Union of Railway, we are representing the operating community basically worldwide, whether we are speaking about infrastructure manager or railway undertaking. So I think I will take that in three sections. The first will be the shorter. For attracting investment, we need a stable environment. The second is to attract investment, we need to be desirable as a solution to the question that we have today for the transport sector. And the third section will be, indeed, if we have a stable environment, if we are desirable, is there an interest, both for the private sector and for the public sector, to invest in railway? And as a matter of fact, is there a financial interest to invest in our sector? So first, the question of a stable framework. So I think, at least if we are speaking about Europe, we have now a stable framework. We have been through a complex series of reforms, the opening of competition, but all of that is, I think, more or less finished. We have a stable structure. We have an understanding from the operators, whether they are infrastructure managers or railway undertakings, that they have to live in this competitive environment. So I will not elaborate on this because you will have an excellent presentation from Kristian Schmidt from DG Move that will explain this framework, but that's really important because for having more investment, we need to have some kind of stability. We need to know what will be the framework. We need to know in particular if there are newcomers or incumbent operators that have some fancy to go in other countries, that the situation will remain stable. So that's a prerequisite. So I will jump directly into the second section, which is how to make investment in rail something that is desirable for the public actors and from a customer perspective. Well, I think that's a quite important question because at the end of the day, what we are pursuing, and it was said in the last panel, is the fact that as rail is the most energy efficient mode of transport, it's quite natural that we have to invest in it and to have quite a massive model shift into rail in the next 10 years. Why is that in a way some kind of necessity? It's relatively simple. I imagine that you have all read the last IPCC report, the one that we received in April. Not perhaps the whole report, but the executive summary is basically 30 pages. And well, it can be summarized basically in two curves. If there is one curve that is showing the emission, since we are actually knowing that there is a problem with emission and with global warming. And what we can see is that the emissions are still growing globally. So there is no decrease into the emission, and that if we do the calculation, and those people did the calculation quite carefully, if we want to keep the warming below 2 degrees, so it's not the Paris objective, it's the degraded objective, we have to reduce the emission by 27% for 2030. It's absolutely huge. We are aiming toward a wall, and we really need to have a very strong action. And basically, railway and to a lesser extent some public transport like metros and so on, they have the characteristics that, if you take railway for instance, in Europe, we are representing about 8% of freight and 17% of, 8% of passenger and 17% of freight traffic, and we are representing 0.05% of emissions. That means as if we shift 10% of the global transport into rail, we have a decrease of the emission of about 9%. And that you will achieve without a single innovation, a single change into the system, just existing technologies. So that means that there is really a need for investing in railways. But the question is there a positive narrative that is associated to this shift? Just that something that is in a way punitive? Well, you will have to not take your car, you will have to take more your bag, public transport and so on. Is there a positive narrative? And well, from UIC perspective, we consider that we have to build, not only from the rail perspective, but from all the actors of the public transport, and perhaps I will also associate in the public transport aviation, we have to build a narrative with, in the middle of the transport system, a very strong rail backbone with more traffic. Well, that's basically also the objective that is within the Green Deal, to double the modal share of rail for freight and passenger. But that's a necessity. But we need indeed to make this necessity something that people would agree. You have to do a project out of that. And that's what we tried to do last year for the COP26. We published what we call the UIC 2030 vision. And what is interesting with this vision is that it's something that is truly global. We started at the end of 2020 to build this vision. And personally, I thought actually that it will take ages to have a consensus among all railway undertaking, all members, on what we had to do. And at the end of the day, it was relatively easy, and in less of 8 months, we had this vision acknowledged by all our members, and Chinese were in, North America was very active there, Middle East, also Africa. And this vision basically gave a perspective how to have a paradigm change. So there is 4 components: transform cities and connecting communities. So that means to use really rail both inside the city and for connecting the cities, and how to make things well planned, in particular with cities and urban planning, to be sure that everything will be effective. To use clean energy and foster technology innovation. So, well, I think that Giorgio made a presentation, and also Joseph, about new technology, but indeed we have at hand within the rail sector technologies that will allow in the, let's say, next 5 years, if implemented, to almost double the capacity on existing lines. So that means that it's indeed possible to have soon more capacity, so we need to invest together. That's a very clear perspective that we can give both to public and private sector. The third thing is to promote intermodality and seamless connection, and that is really something that is, I will not say it's simple, because we didn't actually did it in 20 years, but I think that's something which is now possible if together we are changing our mindset. And I think that's something which is a growing concern among rail operators. For instance, within UIC, we have a project for freight, which is a unified digital platform to make seamless all the question about charging and make, well, that's advertising to make the use of a wagon as simple as the use of a truck. Well, and we hope that at the end of the day it will be the case, but that means that we need to work with the trucking industry, we need to make this innovation working, but there we are really speaking about development that are definitely at hand. Same thing for ticketing. Well, we are developing what we call OSDM, Open Sales and Distribution Model. That's a new data model for ticketing that will allow to reconcile rail, but also public transport, and we are also discussing with IATA to have single ticketing with aviation. So make things simple and seamless for the public. And the final thing is really to transform customer experience, and that also is new. We have to work together to be sure that with all modes and also with cars, because at the end of the day, we will have road, the road network will not disappear, and in less densely populated areas, there will still be cars, but we need to work with them to limit, in fact, the usage of individual vehicle, but in a paradigm that will make things desirable for the customers. And I will finish this section saying that, in a way, the COVID-19 crisis, in big cities at least, shows that at the end of the day, cities with no traffic and almost no car, we experienced it. It was not such an enjoyable experience, but at least we saw it. And speaking for Paris, for instance, I don't think that it would have been possible to have one of the main streets of Paris, La Rue de Rivoli, dedicated to cycling without the COVID-19 experience, because we saw, as living in a big city, those big streets empty, and so we realized that indeed it was possible to have a chance. So we need to change people's mind. And my third component will be, well, how to find financing for all of that. Well, financing, there are capital everywhere, and so when I think that my colleague Mr. Desfontaines will also explain that, but the question is, why investing in rail? What are the drivers for investing in rail? One of the key questions here is indeed that if you invest in rail, rail is paying all its externalities. Road or aviation, for instance, are not paying the externalities. And that's a very complicated economical problem, because indeed you need to invent some financial mechanism to make those externalities that are interesting to see in economic calculation, but are not, at the end of the day, something that is going on the profit and loss account of an investor. So you need to find a way to make those level playing field, how to organize the fact that there is indeed a level playing field, and how to organize the fact that at the end of the day, it's coming to the profit and loss account of the private investor. Because all the other solutions, for example, you could say, in particular in Europe, it's not true in other parts of the world, but as there is a separation between infrastructure manager and our undertaking, you could say, well, okay, you have to have smaller fees on the infrastructure. But at the end of the day, that's only a way to say that you would increase the tax for the people in the street. So not a very satisfactory system. So I think what we should be thinking about, and that will be a collective thinking, is to try to use the carbon markets, and in particular the compensation on the carbon markets, because we all know, for instance, that the obligation for the energy provider or the cement producer, the concrete producer, will be increasingly heavy, and they will need to compensate. And they are already trying to compensate, in having plantation everywhere in the world, and so far and so on. But what will be, I think, a way through, that will be to make investment in rail with certain conditions. We obviously need to assess that indeed when you invest in a new infrastructure, or you invest in new rolling stock, or you invest in new technology, The effect will be indeed to have an actual model shift, so we have to invent a little bit how we will assess that an investment will be, the concentration of an investment will be an actual model shift. But if there is an actual model shift, there is no reason why investment in our sector shouldn't be eligible to compensation. And that, from my point of view, is a relatively simple way to attract capital, because at the end of the day, it will be in the profit and loss account of the investor. Well, obviously, some will pay. Well, road industry, perhaps, aviation, perhaps, energy provider. But at the end of the day, it will be positive for the whole communities. And I think it's, from an purely economic point of view, something which is quite rational, because at the end of the day, all the carbon market are coming from the work of an economist that he called Ronald Coase, and the Coase theorem, that they call it, that theorem that is about bargaining indeed. Why are we producing carbon markets? For a very simple reason, is the Coase theorem. You know, well, I don't know if it has an economic theorem proves anything, but at least say that it could be more optimal to have a bargain between sectors, between actors, than to have a regulation. So I think if we take that as a principle, we have indeed to promote this kind of bargaining between emitting sector and rail. And that will be my conclusion, and I think it makes 15 minutes. Thank you.
Perfectly executed, François. Thank you very much. And I think, François, you highlighted some key points on the need, for example, of some principles, like we say, polluters pay, but also a need for a mindset change to be introduced. What I would suggest is that we go, I think Kristian is with us now, that we go directly with the next set of presentation by Kristian, because this, I think, will complement very much what has been just explained by François. Kristian, I took the liberty already to introduce you before, so I give you now the floor for your presentation.
Thank you, Giorgio. And I think I have a few slides. If you can project them, we can start. But first, let me apologize for being late. The reason being I was negotiating a road transport agreement with Ukraine. So that was quite important. But it also allows me to make the transition to replying to the question that I've been asked, the rail momentum and investing in the future. Ukraine, in fact, in many ways is a good example of how difficult it is sometimes for rail to fulfill the potential it has. Just for your information, 20 million tons of grain has to be exported out of Ukraine in the coming weeks or months. And maritime Black Sea ports are blocked. Of course, exports by trucks, it simply is not proportionate to the volumes we have to shift. And when we turn to the rail sector and say, look, here is a golden opportunity to step in and address this European priority, I must say the reactions coming back is, oh, but we don't have enough rolling stock, there's congestion on the lines. How about insurance for rolling stock coming close to the Polish-Ukrainian border, et cetera, et cetera. So I would like to first echo François' point about the need for a change of mindset in terms of seizing such a sudden market opportunity for rail freight, where really it's not about a few months of emergency investments. It's a systemic shift where Europe needs to strengthen the links overland to our eastern ally. Having said that, of course, I also should balance it by acknowledging everything that the rail companies have done free of charge to help Ukrainian refugees moving to safety. So I must be fair and say that free of charge, our railway undertakings have done
We can see your slide, so we are in the first one.
Go to the second slide, rail momentum, please. I want first to acknowledge that we have a momentum, sustainability and climate change, of course, mentioned by François already. You know the Commission's policy here. We do consider transport as an absolutely key element of the sustainable transition. And I would add to that the third point that customers and passengers are also shifting in their expectations from the rail sector. And I think the answer to the question, Giorgio, about investing in the future must also be about responding to the market, responding to expectations, not a supply-driven approach to the rail sector, but one where our operators, our investors listen more to what is expected from the market. We had the European Year of Rail last year, and clearly we can see governments responding with ambitious plans, but we must ensure that this momentum is more than just a one-year fashion and becomes truly sustainable decisions. So let's move to the next slide, please, ensuring real impact. Again here, momentum, but also opportunities. It's been mentioned already, the reduction in greenhouse gases, and just for the sake of good order, reminding us of our targets that we've set out in our smart and sustainable mobility strategy, doubling high-speed traffic by 2030, and of course these other important targets we've set both on rail freight, on passenger freight, but also on the network and the TEN-T network equipped for meeting these targets. That proposal is, as we speak, being discussed in Council and in Parliament, and of course we only hope that Member States keep the level of ambition that we've set out in our proposal. So really, EU policies have put rail at the heart of our mobility system. I don't think that is something we did just for the European Year of Rail. I believe that the change is here to stay. But next slide, please, a favorable environment. What should rail do to meet those expectations? And here, the regulatory improvements, of course. I will also talk about support, and also, of course, that should be non-discriminatory. François already pointed to the need for a level playing field, and let me just upfront recognize I'm also advocate for road. The level playing field is not there for rail, so it should be improved. going into infrastructure, it is by definition non-discriminatory. If it's into trackside ERTMS, it's extremely necessary. And it's something that benefits all operators, that allows infrastructure managers to lower track access charges, that boosts competition, and it produces a growing market for everyone, a growing cake for the infrastructure managers to refund and recycle revenues into investments. So we need more money, but let's be very clear that that money should not be state aid, it shouldn't be discriminatory, and it certainly shouldn't be to operations. It should be to improve the network on which everybody competes. The third bullet here, of course, is that it is possible, perfectly possible under EU law, to fund also operations under public service obligations. But again, here the market principle must be applied. It should be for services that the market cannot otherwise supply. And again, here I see among member states a need for sticking to the agreed principles of EU legislation. And even when it is agreed that a certain train service needs public subsidies, then of course who delivers that service should be chosen by a competitive tender. So there must be competition for the market and competition within the market. Unless investors see that this is the case, again, what we will have is the publicly financed historic operators, and we will not get, as we have seen in some member states, the benefits of market openings. And you can look at Italy, you can look at Spain, you can look at Sweden, you can see how, where competition was introduced, it certainly increased ridership, it increased investments, and it reduced the ticket price for everyone. So in Italy, for instance, high-speed rail, where government is also now planning to pour in billions and billions into new infrastructure, the effect is quite spectacular, as it is in Spain and other places. Closed markets, on the other hand, will deter investments. Next slide, please, on some regulatory initiatives here, just to recall Fit for 55, I already mentioned. Secondly, our action plan is this whole list of obstacles and barriers to entry that we adopted in December last year and are implementing this year. Infrastructure investments, that is the revision of the 10G regulation. François also mentioned ticketing, and here the Commission is determined to follow the expectation of European citizens for a much improved ticketing platform. It must be multimodal, it must be cross-border, and it must be in one click that you can go from Brussels to Warsaw in one ticket, in one contract, and with your rights protected by the commercial agreements. We're also working on a proposal on the rail freight corridors to improve, again, the operating underlying conditions for rail freight operators. Really, we are not making the progress we should be making in the
Thank you, Kristian. Perfect timing as well. So I think we have seen that Kristian pushed very much the fact that today we have a momentum in the rail system, but I think there is a fil rouge in his message and the message also of François, which is we need to embrace the change and dare to change. So having said this, let's continue our round of presentation. And Paul, can you tell us more? What do you think about this?
Sure, thanks a lot, Mr. Travaini, for the introduction. Indeed, I would say if we do what Mr. Kristian Schmidt has just mentioned, then I'm sure we would attract a lot of private investment. But I'm just going to illustrate it from a point of view of a private operator on rail, because of course, if you talk about railways, we talk about different sectors. Mr. Schmidt has mentioned the supply chain industry, but you also have, of course, the infrastructure managers, but then you have the operators, and I'll just talk about it from a point of view of an operator. And one of the questions is, what Mr. Schmidt also pointed out, is the kind of environment that you have in which you operate, and if that environment is conducive enough for private investment or not. And that's the point I would like to address, because when liberalization was introduced into the rail freight business, expectancies were quite high. Everybody expected that there would be a lot of private investment that would pour into the industry, and you'd get a big growth in terms of rail freight. What has happened actually since liberalization? That's what I want to show. I represent one company, one private company in the rail freight business. It's called Lineas, and today it's actually the only real, the biggest real private rail freight operator in EU. Why I'm saying real? Well, PKP is also private because they're listed on the stock exchange, but I think it's still a different situation. That company that I represent has a staff of 2,000 people and about $500 million revenues. That's okay, but if you consider that this is the biggest private rail freight operator in Europe, then I think it's a poor show, no? How come there are not many more and many bigger ones than Lineas? It's actually a big question. And so I'd like to introduce a little bit what has happened since the liberalization. If we look at the growth figures in rail freight, we had the first phase of growth in the beginning of this century for about 10 years, and this is also when a lot of liberalization was taking place, private players were coming in, but then we had a deep crisis, and since then we haven't really been able to recover, but we have maintained more or less the modal share parameters. If you look at the different phases, like I said, you have a first phase. The second phase was an interesting one where you had a lot of expansion, and you had quite a growth also of the rail freight sector. So challenges coming in were actually creating growth. Since then, new entrants have increased, but it has never led any more to major growth. It has just made sure that the share of rail freight has not gone down. And you can see that here in this figure. This shows that indeed, if you compare the incumbents to, versus the other players, that there is now about 50-50. So you do have a big effect of the liberalization, and you see that also in different countries, the share of the incumbents versus the challengers, that this has been a major shift, and that is still going on. Now, in many cases, the incumbent in one country are the challenges in another country. So it's not just all new entrants or new players, but there are, like I said, new national entrants, and there are new international entrants, which are shown here, and you also see in what countries that they are all active. But has the liberalization done enough to attract the kind of private investment that we need in order to realize the Green Deal objectives? And there the answer is obviously still no. And the reason why is that the liberalization on the one hand has not been aligned, and there is a different timing in every country for that. It has been really, really incomplete so far, and it actually is still not mature yet. If you look at the timing of the liberalization, it is spread out over almost 2 decades now. And that actually has led to a patchwork of different market realities in the EU, which is causing obviously cross-border efficiencies much longer than it should be. and which also create a lot of unequal opportunities among the railway undertakings. And it really depends on whether you're state-owned or not, if you're efficient or not, and it's not necessarily the best railway undertakings that are the big winners in this liberalization process so far. Secondly, the liberalization is incomplete, and I think Mr. Schmidt really pointed it out as well. There is still a lack of structural unbundling in the rail freight when you have holdings leading, to certain persistent unfair competition. And the Commission is still also working on that to make sure that this will be much better in the future. But in the meanwhile, we have already 2 decades behind us of this kind of competition. By itself, it's not a problem, in the sense that competition is good, but it should be fair competition, because if you don't have fair competition, then you don't have a stable environment in order to attract private investment, and that's the issue here. And then the second thing is that it was also done when the market was not mature. If you don't have a single European railway area, well, then it's extremely difficult to liberalize the market and to attract private investment. You still have most of the time a national agenda versus a European agenda, and this not only by the infrastructure managers, but also by and for incumbents. And this is versus the needs for a pan-European approach to realize really a competitive rail freight sector. Secondly, you have unfair competition with the road sector, hardly any internationalization, as François pointed out, and they are benefiting from a single European road area. So if you consider all these factors, it leads to a lack of private investment since there is not enough return on investment. It's as simple as that. We are not profitable enough in order to attract private investment. And if you're not profitable enough, then you're not innovative enough, and then you're in a vicious circle where you stay behind the other transport modes. And we could go into the detail in the panel debate when I will really make the link with innovation when we have a certain, questions about that. So to conclude, liberalization alone is not enough to double weight freight volumes, although it created growth in the first decade of the century, and it slowed the trend of decline in modal share in the second part. But we need a much stronger infra management that is very customer-minded, and particularly with a European mindset. And we need for support, as long as, and not just when they say it each time when we talk about subsidies, it should be time-based. Yes, time-based, but it should be as long as there is no fair competition with the road sector. And then third, we also need a very strong customer-minded regulator with a European mindset. And that's not the case either in many European countries. Some of them are really working along those lines, but quite a few are still not up to that level, I would say. So this is the point I want to make regarding the impact that liberalization has had on the rail freight sector and whether it has been enough to attract private investment. The answer so far is very mitigated, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, especially for being on time. I think you were able to deliver an impressive set of slides very, very quickly. So thank you for this. A lot of information that we are getting from the panelists, but I don't want to stop this trend, and I would like to ask Olivier to present us how investments can increase.
It's okay? Yeah, sorry, super. Yeah, I mean, what I would like to say is it's true that with climate change, with the EU green agenda, the ambition, and now after the COVID, certainly we are in a turning point in this industry, in the rail sector. So let me give a bit a view of a bank who is active in this sector. Here, I put some. This shows that we are very active. I think what is important as a message is we, as a bank, are talking to all the participants of the ecosystem. So we're talking to operators, to manufacturers, to leasing companies, to investors, who could be infrastructure manager, who could be, so when I say infrastructure fund, not in manager, pension fund, insurer. There's a lot of people who are interested by this sector, rating agencies as well, who try to understand how it works and where are the risks. And I think by talking to all these market participants, it gives a bit of insight where these people are looking to this sector. So that's what I would like to maybe to for the time we have here. It's really to focus on two major change, at least these market participants are talking about. I think the first one is really, and all market participants are recognizing that there is clearly a clear ambition on the EU side, and it's as well. It's really like not only the ambition is clear with clear timing and in terms of targets. But as well, it's a question for sure is how we get there, okay? When we say we should double the high speed by 2030 or triple by 2050, it's a huge in terms of capex, in terms of investment, not only in infrastructure, but in rolling stock. Just talking, for example, with a leasing wagon lessor, which is a niche in the freight, but just going from 18 or 17% market share in the rail freight to 30, which is the objective, means for the next 10 years is not 100,000 rail car to be built just to replace the aging fleet, but another extra 100,000 cars just to follow the and wagon. It's a niche. Huh? You have of course locomotive and things like that. So there's a huge investment, and I think what we on one side, and on the other side, it's where this money will come from. And here, maybe just to summarize, certainly COVID here certainly has played a bit an acceleration like on other topics, but clearly, particularly on the way the sector is funded. Because in the past, rail was mainly public funded. Okay, if you looked at the total global capex rolling stock, it's something like maybe 70 billion a year, which was mainly financed by public operators or public transport authorities, so it's really in the public sphere, compared to, for example, the 100 billion capex in the aviation sector, which is purely private funded. And even if you looked at to the trend with, for example, the locomotive lessor, who are investing a lot, still they just represent like 12-13% of the total locomotive. So it's in EU, it's clearly mainly public funded. But where COVID could change, or a bit where we are today, and particularly in front of the capex we have, is COVID certainly put pressure on the public operators in terms of lower revenue and more debt, and there is clearly a debt topic for the public operators. They have constraints, so there is a limit. I mean, if you have a DB, for example, has a rating downgraded, SNCF is under watch, so there is a limit anyway to raise debt. It's not a question of access to capital, compared to an airline who can struggle to get access to capital. For DB, SNCF, it's not a problem to raise money. It's a question of balance sheet, okay? And you have the same topic on the public transport authorities side, because like in France, for example, when you talk to the French region, between 2019 and 2023, because COVID as well has been accelerating, but because they have a lot of capex, lower revenue, they are going to double the debt ratio between 19 and 23. So there is, for example, for the TER, which is the regional train, it has been 100% financed by the region so far in France. So they invest 10 billion in regional trains. But now for the next step, for all the investment in hydrogen, in refurbishment and everything, they have a limit. So they tell us, and as there is an inertia here, they already have to anticipate that they will not be in a position to fund with public budget the next round of investment. So we are in a situation where you have a big ambition, okay? You need money. On the public side, you have after COVID, debt everywhere, at the national level, at the regional level, at the level of the operators. So what do you do? And particularly, how you can continue to invest without continuing to increase the public debt. So here, I mean, that's a good news, is there is a huge appetite from the private sector, whoever you're talking about, to infrastructure fund, pension fund, insurer, bank. I mean, they are all invested to, they're a bit like, they all want to invest in this, what they call green infrastructure. Okay, they have themselves, regulators pushing them to switch from fossil sectors to green sectors. So the money is there. And you can see that where in different segment, you see more activity like in the freight with more leasing, sell and lease back with locomotive and wagon. And you have here, on this sector particularly, you have new players like Railpool, Akiem, Alpha Train, who are investing quite a lot and continue during COVID and continue to and you see some company like Akiem and Railpool are a bit like doubling on the 3-5 years. So it's very active sector where you have private money. I will come back on this. You will need as well on the regional passenger, think how you could combine private with public money. And here I think Germany is well advanced combining with the PTA, using the private money from insurer, to fund the rolling stock for the regional traffic. Something in France as well, the French region are looking at that, how to continue to invest, tapping the private money. You need private money as well on the high speed, again, with either public operator who may want to lease the train, or for the new player like Italo, where they are buying the train, it's clearly private money as well here to fund. So it's clearly what we see as a trend. I think for us, and to come back a bit on the question today, it's and that's why I share as well what have been said is, as the question is not about finding money, there is money, private money, I mean. There is even more money than project, in a way. But what is lacking is profitable project, project who make sense. And I think if we think how we can help and making sure there is more private money, I would say there is a bit like two families of things we have to think about. One is family more on the structural support, making the sector more attractive in terms of business model. So here it's how we can, and I think there was mentioned already some ideas, which is how maybe like in the freight business, reducing track access, or even look at the French high-speed market where track access are very high. There is a lot of opportunity and initiative and ideas to step in. The problem is there is clearly a barrier to entrance because of this track access level, who are pushing more for reducing the frequency and maximizing the yield per seat. So actually, you can help it for making this track access less expensive. Another idea, of course, will be to price the externalities to make things more competitive. So I think there is one family of thinking around how making this sector more attractive or more profitable. And the other family is more about the framework. I think that mentioned by Kristian is how to make sure, because when you invest in a train for 30 years, you need visibility. When it's only among public players, it's a question of decision about need public service. When it's about a private player, you want visibility over 30, 40 years. So it needs clarity on the framework, particularly for competition, that the rule will be the same and fair for everyone. So I think that's really the two aspects, and maybe to focus on one and to finish on that, which is a bit a success story of private money investing a lot in the rail sector is the leasing sector at the end of the day. At least it's usually, you start with that, and as it has been a success story, there is even more money, and it means as well big, high valuation. As we speak, we are advising, for example, Morgan Stanley to sell VTG, which is a big freight lessor. As well, there was last year, Hermeva had been disposed by SNCF. So, and you see that, and Akiem as well is attracting a lot of interest. So it's a way for private money to channel through leasing platform to invest. And now you have very competitive rate when you try to look for a locomotive, for example, in terms of lease rate, because it's liquid, it's very competitive. You have it makes certainly the sector more competitive because of this access to this lease loco. There is no market for high speed or regional train yet for leasing, but that's, I think, a good example where and the UK was in advance on this. I mean, they opened that like 20 years ago. But I think in Europe, I mean, at least it's a first step, and there is already billion invested here, but there is maybe more to come. So that maybe to give you a bit the perspective from a bank.
Thank you very much, Olivier. I think we had a series of very interesting perspectives from the panelists. Thank you very much for this. Initially, I wanted to ask the panelists if they have questions to the presentation they heard from one of each other. But maybe I ask first the question to the people present in the room. If you have questions yourself about the presentation you have just heard. No? More interested in the debate? So we start the debate. So maybe from the presenters themselves, from what you have listened from the presentations from the other colleagues, what you retain, and is there something you want to challenge as well?
Is Kristian still there, or can raise a question?
Kristian is still there, I guess.
I'm still here.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Only 2 more minutes. I have to return to Ukraine.
Okay.
But if I can take the opportunity to agree with the 2 previous speakers with Paul on freight, I think it's one of the areas where competition has made progress, but it hasn't improved the modal share of freight. We are seeing stagnation. We haven't seen the cake growing. We have seen the emergence of some, like Lineas, truly European operators, but we haven't succeeded in reducing the costs, the operating costs that you are facing as a company, and therefore you have not, I mean, you have done well, but the sector as a whole has not succeeded in gaining a greater market share compared to the other modes. So something is working, but it's not working well enough, and therefore we should keep going. To Olivier, I also agree that leasing, I mean, there are some signs of the market responding to the market opening, but if you take, for instance, the sudden momentum we all see, and how there is inertia in then making new rolling stock available. The rail supply industry is recruiting and creating new jobs. That's great, but it does not happen with the speed that the market requires and the momentum calls for. And partly that is because, well, it takes some time to build a new train, but it also is because that some of these leasing companies and some of the incumbents who had perhaps rolling stock that could be refurbished, resold, here non-competitive practices prevent such rolling stock from staying on the market and being made available to new entrants and new operators who would want to come in. So here, I do believe the financial sector has a role to play to cater for those small and new operators. It's perhaps more risky, but it's potentially a lot more promising. And these are some of the new operators who will take the risk and make the cake grow for everyone. I do apologize for having jumped in and made this comment, Giorgio, but I thought the previous speakers made good points I wanted to acknowledge. And with that, I do apologize because I have to get back to Ukraine and leave the floor to my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much, Kristian, especially for the time you dedicated to us and to the rail sector in general. Thank you. So then I bring the ball to the remaining speakers here. So if
I
you
wanted
have,
to raise a question to Kristian, but too late.
too late, I think he needs to leave.
Well, 30 seconds, Olivier.
No, I mean, for me, the main cost in this sector is truck access. I mean, if you look to maybe it's a difficult question, but how the EU the Commission could be more involved, harmonizing, the weights price, because it's so different. I'm sure on the freight side, But depending of the countries, the sectors, is any way to harmonize, to put a cap? I mean, trying to, because it's clearly one of the key major costs for.
First of all, I agree with your analysis. In the current legislation, I don't have a legal basis for dictating track access charges or harmonizing. I don't. The principle is that infrastructure managers are supposed to charge direct costs, and then they can do markups where the market can bear it. I'm not sure necessarily those markups are only applied where the market can bear it. And indeed, the situation in member states is so different in terms of very low track access charges and very high track access charges. And I cannot find any objective economic reason for these differences other than there is a different market model in the various member states. And those member states who set very high track access charges clearly, deliberately or inadvertently, are deterring competition and services being expanded. What we can do and what I will continue to do is to make the case, including in our discussions with infrastructure managers, that if you reduce the track access charges, you will grow the pie, you will generate more volume, more traffic. And we have seen member states who have done it benefit from that effect, and therefore you will increase your revenues by lowering your prices. It's the case if you're a supermarket. It's the case if you are a railway infrastructure manager. But of course, I also understand that from an infrastructure manager's point of view, there are two ways that you can get your revenues: either track access charges or public investments. And so, if we, the Commission, call for lower track access charges, we must also call for significant public investments in infrastructure. And with competition, we must all make sure that the cake is growing, because that's the third secret source of more revenues for the infrastructure manager. So these, I think, Olivier, is my limited powers, but I agree with the analysis that there are in certain member states track access charges that are too high, and we will continue to advocate the interest in the countries themselves of reducing them. I hope that answers to some extent your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristian.
Thank you indeed. Are there any burning questions from the panelists? No? Maybe Paul?
Yeah, I think it was interesting to hear the point of view from a banker's perspective, and I think what he's saying is quite right, but where do you see possibilities for private investment? We see it in the supply, on the supply side, obviously. The supply industry, both in terms of leasing companies as well as producers of equipment. But the reason why there is a possibility for private investment there, because it's cost plus. Everybody can take a margin. But I don't see that happening with the operators. I don't know if many people in the hall know how many operators in the rail freight sector, for instance, make a profit. Does anybody know any? Yeah? And since how many years haven't they made any profits? So how can we expect to attract private investment, and how can we expect that we will be investing much more into rolling stock, like Kristian has said, grain exports? Yeah, let's get 100 wagons tomorrow to start grain exports here, but who's going to pay for it? That is really the crucial factor. And one of the things that I blame the sector for, because we can blame externalities that are not integrated and so also, but also as a sector we are just way too slow in adapting. And we speak about, we have a momentum now for 5 to 10 years. I rather think it's going to be 5. But if you look at all discussions taking place in order to harmonize, in order to digitalize, it's just mind-boggling how difficult we make it ourselves, and how slow we will be in innovation. And I take one example, ERTMS. It's a typical example, but if we as a private operator, we want to make sure, we're fully behind the idea of ERTMS, and the whole sector wants to have it done, but the time it takes in order for us to have any productive effect as an operator, it's 25, 30 years from now. But the investments are here today, and not only today, but 2 years from now again, and then for another country again in 3, 5 years' time. It's prohibitive. And no customer will pay any penny more for having ERTMS, because a little bit more security for a sector that is already 100 times more secure than the road sector. Not a penny more will the client pay for that. Yet we are faced with €500,000 per locomotive per country almost to invest in that. And how come it is that expensive? And that's where the supply industry is not following what is needed for railway operators, and where there's no push enough from the railway operators, whether they're public or private, to change it also. I mean, if you look at the discussions we have on ERTMS and the TSIs, it's mind-boggling what we are saying. On the one hand, we want stability, and François and everybody wants stability in ERTMS, but saying we want to have the baseline frozen for the next 10 to 20 years, I think they're laughing their heads off in the road sector. Huh? No innovation in ERTMS in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, so this is the wrong mental approach. Secondly, when we're talking about the changes in the TSI and corrections that are possible for suppliers, the time they will get in order to adapt, 3.5 to 4 years. That's the lifespan from drawing a truck to commercializing a truck. They do it in 3 years. I mean, and here we're allowing suppliers to make small changes to something that has been agreed upon for another 3.5 years. The cost that we're talking about for making these changes, they're talking about €300,000 per locomotive. I mean, if you see that kind of discussions taking place at an official level where we as a sector are willing to accept that, I don't see how we're going to get competitive on this one innovation that is absolutely needed, that is absolutely the basis for the digitalization. And that's just one example. We can talk about DAC. The DAC is absolutely necessary as well. It should create productivity gains of 25-30% in the rail freight sector. So there should be a business case. But somehow the business case will only become reality maybe after 15 years. And that's when we get the whole, the whole migration done in a period from 2018 till 2025. This is not possible for private companies. So as long as we are in this kind of an environment, then the environment is not conducive enough for attracting private investment, at least not for operators. And that's my conclusion so far. And we've been trying to, as a private operator, to do everything we can to change it. We've even set up a company for developing ERTMS, but that's not our role. But just to make sure that the market starts working in a different way, creating an ecosystem. The whole supply chain market is hardware embedded software. That doesn't exist anymore in the car industry. The navigation system in the car industry, it's not supplied by Mercedes or BMW. Huh? It's the Googles, it's the TomToms, it's other. The whole software development of cars is not done by the car industry. And we are developing ERTMS by the suppliers that make the hardware for locomotives. The way they create software is the way software was created in the 80s.
Clear. Paul, I think François wants to intervene.
Yeah. So I just made a few points on that.
No, but not that I disagree. I think I more or less agrees on what have been said. But, well, I would like to come back perhaps on this question of track access charges, because indeed that's a very important question. Well, as being a former civil servant, I remember having negotiated the recast of the Directive 2012-34. And indeed, what is really a pity, and well, I think that's a point we collectively should make as rail operator, that's a definition of the track access charges. So it's Article 31, paragraph 3. And I read, is the cost that is directly incurred as a result of operating the train service. So if anyone that has some study in economy can tell me what does it mean, I would really be happy to know it. Because, well, if you have made some economics, you know that there is a full cost and there is a marginal cost. And the cost that is directly incurred as a result of operating the train service is basically anything between marginal cost and full cost. So at the end of the day, there is absolutely no surprise that there are such discrepancies between countries. And after all, that's absolutely normal because there is huge discrepancies about the tax availability of the different countries. So I will not enter into the details. Some have money, some have not. At the end of the day, well, we can say everything we want about market, about competition, whatever. Competition is good by nature. We have all made economics, at least vulgarization, so we know that competition is good, but competition is good if you have the right framework. And indeed, competition has been good, for instance, in Italy, because in Italy they had a lot of available capacity. So when Italo came into the Italian market, there was a lot of capacity between, well, let's say, Rome and Milano. And then two operators, they made a very good business. The revenue increased both for Italo and for Trenitalia, but it's due to the fact that the capacity was there and everything was ready for that. Well, if you take another example, which is between Lyon and Paris, there is no capacity available. So at the end of the day, since there is no capacity available, either somebody, most probably the state, is investing in a very, very costly infrastructure to create capacity, and then competition will make what it did in Italy, and there will be more traffic, more revenues. So, well, all of that to say that we are in a quite a complex system. It's a network, and more than that, it's a patchwork of different national networks. So, well, what collectively we are achieving, both the regulator and the operator, to make a single European network out of that is something extremely difficult. And, well, I should pay a tribute to what is happening, for instance, with Shift2Rail. We are trying, indeed, with Europe's Rail now, we are trying collectively to try to address all the points that Paul made, actually. We really need to go from a definition of the technical specification of interoperability that are been made basically to foster competition into being able to foster competition and have a consistent system. And that's something which is relatively new, quite complicated. And once again, I insist, everything will be in the will of our customer and our citizen to go into a paradigm change. So if we can foster this paradigm change, we will succeed. And I will finish in giving two examples. And, well, interestingly enough, that's a conclusion of a report from the European Court of Auditors that was in, I think, in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So they made an evaluation about just what you talked about, Paul, about, well, the effect of competition on the freight market. So, very interesting report, but at the end of the day, they said a very simple thing. In the frameworks that we know, the regulatory framework, there were 3 examples of success in fostering freight: Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, because they installed a public regulation that were putting modal shift as an objective of the public policy, with different means to achieve that. I will not enter into the detail, but at the end of the day, they were the only one to have a strong growth of the freight market. And I think, mutatis mutandis, that what we have to do, and indeed all of that is complementary, but competition alone will not do the trick.
Thank you, François. I don't think we have the round for another set of questions, unless the panelists really want to make a final statement, then maybe we can close here the session. And I will tease a bit all of you and also the panelists to think a bit, because the session was very much interesting, but also to attract investment outside, let me say, the current businesses, processes Maybe also, I don't know, Uber, is it an operating company, transport company? I don't know. But in a way, they didn't wait to have the autonomous car to attract private investment and make a new business. So with this, I conclude this session. I thank you very much, the people that remained also here to listen to this session. I'm sure that online there are plenty of other observer to this interesting session that gain a lot out of the presentation for this speaker, and a round of applause to all the speakers still here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.